All right, everybody, let's settle down. We have a pretty full house today. Seems like everybody woke up wanting to start the new year right, get our relationship with God right, make the right decisions, wake up a little early on Sunday. If it is your first time here, before we transition into the message, we always have 2 minutes where we practice something called silence and stillness. It could be a little awkward. It could even feel a little strange for some people who haven't done this, but this is a practice in the way of Jesus that kind of helps us to center ourselves. It really gives us space to become present with our souls, with ourselves, and with God. So before I go into the word, we're going to spend 2 minutes of silence, and then we'll get into the message. Amen. As we enter into the new year, and as I was just praying and meditating over the last month as 2024 was coming to an end, my heart was starting to get compelled to take a momentary pause on the book of Mark. How many of y'all have been enjoying the book of Mark? We started exactly a year ago. And as we're coming to a new year, I just felt compelled to take a momentary pause on the book of Mark and resume the last 2 chapters of Mark in March as we go into Lent for 7 weeks during that time. And so what I decided to do, and I made this final decision this past Sunday. I was vacillating this past month because I want to finish this book, this gospel. Sorry to the media team and the creatives who had to put all this together the last 3 days. But I decided that I wanted to kick off the new year through a new series through the book of Proverbs. So for the month, people are like, ooh, those are church folks, for those of you guys who don't know. So for the months of January and February, we're going to be walking through the book of Proverbs under the theme and series title, Building Your Life with Wisdom. Okay, dang, everybody wants that self-help right now. It's that self-help vibe. See, Proverbs, however, different from the Gospel of Mark, which is a narrative, rather than preaching through it verse by verse and passage by passage, we're going to approach it theme by theme. When you read a gospel or a story, it's easy for you just to go through the entire book. But Proverbs is unique in that it is a wisdom literature and is really written in a very distinct style. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs is a letter from Solomon to his son, encouraging him to build his life on the fear of the Lord and to seek wisdom as the highest priority of his life. And then chapters 10 through 29 are just hundreds of one-liners and two-liners that feel much like a Twitter thread without really cohesive or coherent train of thought, but just these nuggets of wisdom that unpack what Solomon was trying to impart to his son. And the last 2 chapters of the book of Proverbs are actually from two individuals we don't know much about, and they actually play as a model citizen or a model person of what it looks like to live in accordance to the wisdom of Solomon. And as we kick off the new year, the reason why I wanted to focus on the word build is because everybody, when the beginning of the year starts, we're all wanting to build and have a meaningful year. The book of Proverbs talks about building wealth, a godly way versus an unjust way. The book of Proverbs talking about building your career and getting clarity in your calling. It even talks about building your family under the fear of the Lord. But today, as we kick off the series through the book of Proverbs, the title of my message is Building One's Life on the Fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is mentioned 14 times in the book of Proverbs. It's alluded over 200 times in the Old Testament and over 50 times in the New Testament. In fact, as I was researching for the book of Proverbs, many commentators and scholars say the book of Proverbs may be more about the fear of the Lord than it actually is about the wisdom of God. The fear of the Lord is like the roots to a tree, and the wisdom of the Lord is like the fruit that grows from the roots of fear. The fear of the Lord is the foundation in which we build our lives with wisdom, and wisdom is built upon the solid foundation and roots of the fear of God. Proverbs 1:7 says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The word beginning is to emphasize the importance, the essentiality, the cruciality that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all things. But then it says here, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And what knowledge is Solomon talking about? He tells us in two other passages. It says, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find knowledge of what? Of God. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is insight. This means having a healthy and biblical understanding of the fear of the Lord is the key to having knowledge and knowing God intimately. So the question at hand today that we want to answer as we kick off January is, what is the fear of the Lord, and how can we build our lives? And how can we center this year around the fear of God? So the roadmap for today is threefold. First, I'm going to be taking some time to talk about what the fear of the Lord is not. Then I'll be expounding on what the fear of the Lord is. And lastly, how we can build our lives around the fear of God. Let's start with what the fear of the Lord is not. In order for me to illustrate what the fear of the Lord is not, let me use a spectrum that I found very helpful from a pastor named Rich Velodis in New York. This spectrum helps us understand the balance between two extremes. On one side of the spectrum, it'll be behind me, is being afraid of God. And on the other side of the spectrum is being too familiar with God. And in the center, somewhere in the middle, in the tension of embracing both realities, is the biblical understanding of the fear of the Lord. Let's start with the fear of the Lord is not the same thing as being afraid of God. Some of us have grown up with the view that thinks that God is some cosmic being or a judicial judge who is evaluating our every move and decision that we make. We view God as if he's sitting at a desk with a clipboard, constantly evaluating us as we live, as God's primary role in our lives is one, keeping score, marking our mistakes, every shortcoming, and every failure. When you and I view God this way, our relationship with God feels more like a cold, pressure-filled performance review than a warm, life-giving relationship of a loving Father. With this mindset, every day becomes a test. Every month becomes a test. In fact, every year becomes a test. And you're afraid of failing. When you pray, you ask yourself, did I pray enough? When you go to church, you ask yourself, am I involved enough? When you read the word, you feel like you're just checking off a checklist or an active duty instead of being filled with joy and peace that comes from having a relationship with God. This view of God, of being afraid of him, creates an exhausting life. One that's filled with performance, low-grade anxiety, because you're trying to win the approval of a God who already loves you unconditionally. Going a little deeper, when we view God through the lens of evaluation and fear, we see him as someone who's always waiting to discipline us. Life becomes a series of cause and effects where hardship and difficulties feel like God is out to get us for something we did wrong or for something we're not doing right. This is why a lot of Christians are extremely superstitious. I have learned when we live being afraid of God, we become superstitious and we think everything is happening because God is disappointed in us. We have these inner scripts, this inner dialogue between ourselves and between God. It might not be outspoken, but it's playing in your bed as you're laying to sleep. You start to say things like this: I can't find a job, and I didn't get that promotion because I didn't pray enough. I know as a preacher, when God doesn't use me when I preach, I go like, man, I should have fasted. We have an inner script that says, I am financially struggling because it's been a long time since I've been to church. Let's go as the new year begins. I'm sick physically, or someone I love is sick physically because God is punishing me for something I did wrong. Or my child or my teenage child is struggling in school because I failed as a parent, and now God is holding me accountable. You see, the problem of being afraid of God is that being afraid of God turns our relationship with God to something that's transactional and not relational. When you're afraid of God, we think to ourselves, when I do something for him, he'll do something for me. I obey out of the consequences of fear and punishment and not love. And the problem with a transactional relationship with God is that it robs us of the intimacy of a loving, comforting Father who is not your boss, who's basing your life on your performance. And how do you know you're living afraid of God? When you're afraid of someone, you avoid them. When you do something wrong, or when life gets difficult, you avoid God. Instead of running to God into the ocean of grace when you make a mistake or sin, you run away from God in shame and guilt because you're afraid. Instead of running to God when life is hard and things get difficult, you run away from God in discouragement and despair because you think it's God who's ruining your life. It's like your life is a game of whack-a-mole. Remember growing up? Whack, whack, whack. You're waiting for the next whack from God. I didn't pray, whack. I didn't go to church, whack. I didn't love my wife, whack. And your life is just a series of fear, of consequences, because you think God is trying to punish you for what you did or didn't do. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, some of us, especially in the West, especially at Beloved, throwing myself in there, we are too familiar with God. When you are too familiar with God, we lose a sense of God's holiness, God's reverence, and God's glorious majesty. There is an overemphasis on God's grace and kindness. So we approach God way too casually. There is no longer a sense of consequences or making decisions with life with God in mind, with God as King and Lord over your life. Oftentimes, people who grew up in church or who think they understand the grace of God, we can become way too familiar with God. I am fully aware that my kids are pastors' kids. During worship, they are sitting down, picking their nose, and just looking at my phone, going through my pictures. And sometimes I look at them and say, oh my God, they are way too familiar with the presence and the glory of God. And oftentimes for people who grew up in church and who hear about the grace and love of God, we get too familiar with God that begins to lead us to flirt with sin. You may not be sinning in the literal sense, but you find yourself flirting with sin. When you're too familiar with God, you may not be having an affair, but you're flirting in the office. When you're too familiar with God, you might not be cheating on your spouse, but you're texting this person more than you should. When you're too familiar with God, you might not be lying outright, but you find yourself exaggerating over and over and over. When you are too familiar with God, you might not be watching explicit nudity, but you watch shows that you know that is grieving your spirit. But because we are way too familiar with His kindness and goodness, we say all is well, all is well, all is good. And that is not the fear of the Lord. When I was preparing for this message, I was reminded of a passage in 2 Samuel chapter 6, when King David becomes king, and for his first act, at his inauguration, he says, we need to recover the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament was the chosen place and item where God chose to reveal His manifest glory, holiness, and presence. So it says in 2 Samuel chapter 6 that He gathers 30,000 soldiers. And he goes to the house of Abinadab to recover the Ark of the Covenant, because before that, the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, and they weren't sure if they needed to have a military army to make sure they're able to retrieve the glory, the holiness, and the presence of God. And as they're going there, they have instruments, they have music, they have praise, they're dancing, they're celebrating, they're excited. And this narrative gets really interesting because it says Uzzah, who was a son of Abinadab, which means for the last 2 years, the Ark of the Covenant was at his house. So he's familiar with the presence of God. He's gotten comfortable with the Ark of the Covenant being in his living room as his dad was holding it till David got it. It says, as they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the oxen, they stumbled and the ark begins to fall. Read this passage with me. It says, and David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah, everyone say Uzzah, put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. It's like, what? Why so intense, Lord? Why so extreme? What people don't know is, according to Leviticus, there was a very specific way the ark of God was supposed to be handled. It was only supposed to be carried by priests who were cleansed and sanctified. It was only supposed to be carried in poles and not by animals. And Uzzah, when he sees the oxen about to fall, what does he do? He reaches out his hand to grab it. Why? R.C. Sproul says this: the reason why he reaches out his hand to grab it is because he thinks the floor is dirty, but he forgot that his hand was even dirtier. He thought for that moment, oh, I want to respect God. I want to honor God, so I don't want his presence to touch the dirt that's dirty and messy. And he forgot that his hand was more dirty and more sinful and more evil and more wicked than the dirt that was on the floor. And in this moment, God wants to remind the nation of Israel, I may be a comforting father, but I'm also a consuming fire. And we need to live in both realities, in both tensions, and receive them in our hearts to be able to live in accordance to biblical fear. Rich Velotis, in his sermon explaining the spectrum of the fear of the Lord, gives such a powerful physical embodiment of how our prayer posture should embody both of these realities. This is what he says. He says, when he's waking up in the morning and doing his devotionals, he's talking to a comforting father. So he sits like this. This is how I start my day almost every morning. I sit on my porch. Lord, help me with these kids. Help me, Jesus, dear God. Help me not to kill them. Thank you, Lord, Jesus. And I'm in his comfortable embrace. So I feel peace. I feel all is well. Because I'm in front of an embracing Father. This is an appropriate posture. He says, however, there are other times that our posture should look like this. That sometimes we have to remember we're not just before any being or any person, but we're kneeling before the King of Kings, in which every tongue shall confess and every knee shall bow that he is Lord and he is King. And if you don't find yourself every now and then on your knees, and Rich Velotis even goes a little further by quoting the book of Psalms where David says, I lay prostrate, I lay my face down because I'm not even worthy to stand in the presence of a holy king. You see, we have to live in both realities, and we have to ask ourselves, which side of the spectrum do we find ourselves in? So then the question then is, what is the fear of the Lord? What is the fear of the Lord? The fear of the Lord is an inner rearranging awe that cultivates reverence and frees us from every other fear. It's not about terror, but about rightful worship, a recognition of his holiness and presence in our lives. At its core, the fear of the Lord, according to the book of Proverbs, is to trust in the Lord with all our hearts, to not lean on our own understanding, but instead to acknowledge him in all our ways. And he makes our path straight. And Proverbs tells us not to be wise in your own eyes, but fear the Lord. The reason why the fear of the Lord is essential is because it reorients what we focus on. It shifts our focus away from ourselves and from our idols, and it places it on God. Eugene Peterson says this: the fear of the Lord pulls us out of our preoccupation with ourselves, our feelings, our circumstances, and it pulls us up into wonder. It's not about cowering in terror, but about living in awe-filled reverence, fully aware of both his justice and his mercy, both his holiness and his grace. I think a great illustration of someone who doesn't live in the fear of the Lord, then transitions into the fear of the Lord, is the same as someone who is single and they transition into marriage. I think every good and godly husband has a proper fear of their wife. Come on, somebody, I'm preaching now. A husband who does not have a healthy and an appropriate fear of their wife will live as, I just snorted, will live as if they're still single, and a dose of healthy, godly fear of their partner is appropriate and helpful. For example, a husband without a healthy fear might casually say, I'm going out with the boys tonight. I'm going to grab dinner. But a husband with a healthy fear and respect of his wife pauses and thinks, wait a minute, how many times did I go out this week? When was the last time she had a girls' night out? Did I check in with her? Is she going to need help with the kids? Am I pouring into her cup as much as I'm using her and other things to pour into my cup? A husband without a fear of his wife sees trash overflowing. I'm using myself, by the way. It's all talk about me. And dishes piling up. And they think to themselves, it's not that bad. I'll deal with it later. But a man with healthy fear immediately grabs the bag because he knows ignoring it comes at his own demise. A husband without a healthy fear of his wife makes a big financial purchase, thinking it's fine. But a man who has the wisdom of God checks in with his wife before and says, I'm thinking about purchasing this. What do you think? Now, tying it back to God, the same is true with our relationship with God. When we lack the fear of the Lord, we live as if God is not part of our decisions. We use our money without thinking about stewardship and generosity. We do with our bodies to ourselves or to someone else whatever we want without thinking about the fact that we are the temple of God. We make rash and impulsive decisions without thinking about living a life that is God-honoring. We act and do and talk and behave without considering our choices, aligning with His holiness, with His word, and with His will for our lives. But when we cultivate a proper fear of the Lord, it shapes how we live, love, and decide. It reorients our hearts and minds to Him. Just like a healthy fear in marriage reorients the husband's heart or the wife's heart towards their partner. And this is true in every relationship, by the way. Every now and then I need to remind my kids the fear of their father. My God, this morning, it took 25 minutes to get to the car. And I was being the gentle parent. Gentle parenting does not always work. Sometimes you got to remember, do not spare the rod. So I was like being so patient. I was like, oh my gosh, Bear, you look so beautiful today. You look so good. Get in the car. No, Daddy. Okay, what do you want? You want milk? Oh, here's your milk. Now get in the car. No, Daddy. All right, get in the car right now. And she was like, let's go. And we got in the car and they started fighting with each other. And I was okay, I messed up. And my son was acting up and I turned the music off and said, listen up, children. This stops right now. It worked. Sometimes the difficulties we go through, the hardships we go through, is God waking us up for being way too familiar and way too comfortable with church life and the grace of God. And He needs to shake you up, to wake you up, to say, look, I'm not just a teddy bear. I'm a consuming fire. A few more things and we'll end this. As I was reading this, I was asking myself, why is it the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom? and not the love of the Lord that is the beginning of the knowledge of God. Because after all, love, I thought and think, is the most central to our relationship with God. I think the reason why it's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of the knowledge of the Holy One is because it's actually our greatest fears that reveal our greatest loves. Tim Keller, in his book, Idols of the Heart, or Counterfeit Gods, says, if you really understand your greatest fears, you will understand what your heart is most after in life. Your deepest fears and your greatest anxieties will reveal to you what you are looking towards for identity, security, and significance in place of God. Trace your fears the way we trace smoke to a fire. Your fears will lead you to what we've put above God. For example, if you're looking for people's approval, your greatest fear is rejection and conflict. If you're looking for power and status, your greatest fear is humiliation and being overlooked or disrespected. Someone taps your head, you're like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. If you're looking for success as your ultimate, your greatest fear is failure and mediocrity. This is my problem. I tell my wife, I would rather die than be mediocre. That's how messed up I am, okay? If you're looking for ultimate love, that ultimate partner, your greatest fear is being alone. Your greatest fears reveal where our hearts are most vulnerable to idolatry, what it clings to for identity, what it grasps for security, and what it holds for significance. These fears show us what we love and value most, and they also show us what we have elevated above God. The good news is, this is why the fear of the Lord is important. Because it's only the fear of God that has the power to free you from all other fears. When God is at the center of our hearts, when our deepest awe, adoration, reverence, and trust are directed towards Him, everything begins to fall back into place. You no longer fear rejection because you know God's love is unchanging. You no longer fear failure because your identity isn't tied to what you do, but is tethered to what Christ has done. You no longer fear humiliation because through Christ you are crowned with glory. Proverbs 14:26 says this, in the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence. Proverbs 19:23 says this, the fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. When the fear of the Lord is the foundation of our lives, it reorders our heart. It frees us going into this year seeking approval, power, and success, and instead it replaces it with thanksgiving, praise, contentment, and joy. This is why, as we kick off the new year, we need to build our lives in this year on a biblical, appropriate, healthy understanding of the fear of God. As I come to a close, I just want to look at an interesting interplay of words that is used of Genesis 22 when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah, okay? And God uses both the word love and fear in place of one another after Abraham obeys. Genesis and this story of Abraham offering up Isaac powerfully shows the connection between love, fear, and trust. God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable, to take his son Isaac, the son of the promise whom he loves, and to offer him as a sacrifice. I know that sounds really cruel, but I know so many fathers who sacrifice their sons for their careers. I know so many spouses who sacrifice their marriage for the sake of their own pride. We'll get to this a little more. But in Genesis 22, verse 2, the language here, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, whom you've cherished, whom you've placed all your hope, all your security as your offspring. As you're about to die, he's placed every burden on his son. And go to the land Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. And as the narrative goes on in verses 11 through 12, he picks up the knife and God stops him, and it says this, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said to him, here I am. He says, do not lay your hand on the boy or harm him or do anything to him. But look at the language. For I know you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son. Notice, he does not say, for I know you love God. He says, no, for I know you fear God. Here's the connection. It is our fear of the Lord that has the power to dismantle other fears and other lovers and puts God at the center of our hearts. Abraham's willingness to trust the Lord with what he loved most, with what he held the dearest. Because idolatry is not just doing bad things, it's taking good things and using them as a substitute for what only God can provide. And here's the thing about idolatry. At best, idols are distractions. At worst, they'll destroy you. And what was happening at this time was he was putting all his dreams, all his hopes, all his security, all his future on his son. And he was saying, you don't know this, Abraham, but this is going to destroy you, and you're also going to destroy your son. We've had parents who've idolized us, and they forced their dreams upon us. They forced their religion down our throats and not giving you the freedom to become who you are. And oftentimes God tests us in these areas because we all have Isaacs. We all have these ultimate fears to reveal to us that he wants to sit on that place alone. Now, last thing, here's the power to surrender. Here's the power of surrendering your greatest fears. While God stopped Abraham from sacrificing his son, centuries later, he did not stop himself for sacrificing his son on Mount Calvary. Back in those days in Mesopotamia, it was common for the gods to ask people to offer up children as sacrifice. But the God of our Bible doesn't do that. He sacrifices his son on our behalf. The power to surrender and the power to bring our greatest fears into the hands of God is to see a God who died on our behalf. And we stand and kneel in wonder and we respond in worship for him doing on our behalf what we could not do for ourselves. When we see that Jesus faced the ultimate rejection so that we could be fully and eternally accepted. When we can see that Jesus endured ultimate humiliation so that we can be crowned with glory. And when we see that Jesus bore the punishment of our sins so that we can be forgiven and free, his love breaks us free from all the fears that we have in our lives. And we are no longer defined by our failures and our shortcomings and our misplaced loves, but we are now defined by Jesus' obedience and faithfulness. As I come to a close, 3 application points, and we'll respond with a song. How do we build and grow in the fear of the Lord? Here's the first application question. First, identify which side of the spectrum do you find yourself falling into. When I first got saved, it was definitely I was afraid of God because I was so thankful because I messed up my life. I was just so thankful, so I just tried to live perfectly. These last 4 years, I've been way too familiar with His grace. I've gotten way too comfortable. I used to always kneel when I prayed. I can't remember the last time I knelt. And so for me, as I was preparing this message, I was saying, Lord, I'm sorry. Restore an appropriate understanding of your holiness and the depth of my sins. Number 2, another way we can grow in the fear of the Lord is try to identify what fear dominates your life. You know why fears are so important? It's not just idols. It's forming you to become a type of person. It's forming you to become an impatient person with your children. It's forming you to become manipulative. It's forming you to become anxious and depressed. Identify which fear is dominating your life and bring it before the feet of Jesus and wonder at the cross. And lastly, if you're looking for a Bible reading plan as you go into the new year, let's read the book of Proverbs. Feel free on your own to open that book and just read a chapter or 2 in the month of January. Let's all stand and we're going to respond with a song.